Early in A$AP Rocky's career, Drake played a meaningful role in elevating him. At a time when Rocky was still transitioning from Harlem's underground energy into a global spotlight, Drake's cosign wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. Tours, features, public alignment. In an industry that often guards opportunity like territory, Drake opened doors. But early support in hip-hop is rarely free of expectation. Drake's approach to mentorship has always walked a delicate line between generosity and influence. He amplifies artists, but proximity to him also places them within his orbit, where power dynamics are unspoken yet understood. Rocky, fiercely independent by nature, never fully assimilated into that gravitational pull. That tension lingered quietly for years. Rocky built his own lane, fashion, art, global identity, separate from Drake's brand of emotional accessibility and chart consistency. They remained cordial, occasionally collaborative, but never fully aligned. Then came the personal line. Rumors surrounding Rihanna, one of the most emotionally significant figures in Drake's life, reignited old resentments. Rocky's relationship with her wasn't industry gossip. It was public, committed, and permanent. Whether Drake ever expected exclusivity or not, the symbolism was unavoidable. The question fans rarely ask, but should, is this: when professional respect collides with personal history, which one survives? Drake never publicly attacked Rocky over Rihanna. He didn't need to. His music did the talking. Subtle lines, coded references, emotional ambiguity that allowed listeners to fill in the blanks. Rocky, meanwhile, said almost nothing. But silence is not neutrality. By the time Rocky appeared aligned with Metro and Future's movement, whether musically, visually, or symbolically, the pattern had already formed. Drake wasn't being confronted by enemies. He was being distanced by former allies. And that distinction matters. Because enemies attack. Former allies withdraw. So why did so many choose distance at the same time? The iceberg effect. What the public never sees. For casual listeners, these moments feel sudden, like explosions. But inside the industry, nothing detonates without pressure building first. Drake's longevity is unprecedented in modern rap. A decade and a half of dominance reshapes ecosystems. It changes how opportunities circulate. It affects who gets heard, who gets prioritized, and who gets overshadowed, even unintentionally. Ask yourself, how many artists had their biggest moments after Drake stepped away from a sound? How many had to wait until his interest shifted? Influence doesn't require malice to create resentment. Sometimes it only requires presence. And Drake's presence has always been total. Producers adjust their palettes when he enters a space. Radio shifts formats. Streaming algorithms tilt. When Drake releases, the industry pauses, even if no one admits it. At some point, admiration quietly turns into fatigue. Not from fans. From peers. That fatigue doesn't mean artists want Drake gone. It means they want room. Room to define eras. Room to shift sound. Room to claim cultural leadership without orbiting someone else's gravity. So when Metro Boomin helped create an environment where multiple artists could speak, without speaking directly, it wasn't just about Drake. It was about decentralization. Why this moment felt collective, not coordinated. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this cultural shift is the idea of conspiracy. There was no group chat, no secret meeting, no unified manifesto. What existed instead was alignment of timing. Each artist arrived at the same emotional conclusion independently, but expressed it simultaneously. Metro felt dismissed. Future felt sidelined. Kendrick felt misframed. The Weeknd felt unresolved. Rocky felt personally crossed. Different wounds. Same source. Drake's response, framing it as 20 versus 1, revealed something important. He recognized the scale, but not the cause. Because from Drake's perspective, loyalty should outlast discomfort. From theirs, respect should evolve. And here's the uncomfortable question no one likes to ask. Can dominance survive without adaptation? Drake's defensive strength. And its limits. Drake has always been exceptional at reframing narratives. When challenged, he rarely retreats. He reframes. If critics call him commercial, he points to consistency. If rivals call him safe, he points to longevity. If artists distance themselves, he questions their relevance. This strategy has worked, repeatedly. But what happens when reframing stops convincing peers, even if it still convinces fans? Push UPS wasn't weak. It wasn't sloppy. It wasn't panicked. It was calculated. But calculation lacks surprise. And hip-hop culture rewards disruption. Kendrick understood that. Metro understood that. They weren't trying to outchart Drake. They were trying to outposition him culturally. That's why the response didn't sound frantic. It sounded settled. The moment that changed how the public listened. Once Kendrick entered the narrative, the conversation shifted permanently. Because Kendrick doesn't argue numbers. He argues meaning. When he rejected the Big Three framing, he wasn't just addressing Drake. He was rejecting consensus itself. And consensus has always benefited Drake. Drake thrives when the industry agrees he belongs everywhere. Kendrick thrives when the industry debates why someone belongs. That difference is philosophical. So the question became, is Drake the center of the culture, or its most successful participant? For years, those two things were the same. In 2024, they diverged. Why this doesn't mean Drake is losing. It's tempting to frame this as downfall. That would be inaccurate. Drake didn't lose relevance. He didn't lose fans. He didn't lose visibility. What he lost, temporarily or permanently, was uncontested authority. And authority is harder to reclaim than popularity. Because popularity comes from audience. Authority comes from peers. So now the culture waits. Not to see who wins, but to see who adapts. Will Drake recalibrate? Will he re-engage collaboration differently? Will he release music that responds emotionally rather than strategically? Or will he double down on dominance, trusting that time will dissolve resistance? That question remains unanswered. And that uncertainty, that tension, is why this moment matters. The accumulation effect. How Drake became the center of his own storm. Rocky never denied it. In fact, he did the opposite. In interviews over the years, A$AP Rocky openly acknowledged Drake as one of the first major artists to genuinely amplify his platform. At a time when Rocky was still transitioning from underground darling to global figure, Drake extended a hand that mattered. Features, cosigns, visibility. In an industry where momentum can vanish overnight, that support carried weight. For a while, everything seemed aligned. They collaborated. They shared stages. They moved within the same creative orbit without friction. There was no public rivalry. No obvious tension. No lyrical warfare. From the outside, it looked like mutual respect had settled into something stable. So what changed? The answer isn't musical. It isn't competitive. And it isn't sudden. The shift happened quietly, when professional overlap collided with personal reality. And that distinction is everything. When admiration becomes emotional investment. Drake's admiration for Rihanna was never subtle, coded, or hidden behind metaphor. It lived openly, in interviews, in lyrics, in award show moments, and in the now infamous 2016 MTV Video Music Awards speech, where Drake stood on a televised stage and declared his love in front of the world. Whether that moment reflected a mutual understanding or a deeply unbalanced emotional dynamic has been debated endlessly. But one thing was undeniable. Drake was emotionally invested. Publicly. Consistently. And without ambiguity. That kind of openness carries risk, especially when emotions don't resolve cleanly. Rocky's connection to Rihanna unfolded in a completely different register. Their history stretched back years. They toured together. Collaborated creatively, existed within the same social and fashion ecosystems long before romance entered the conversation. When their relationship eventually became public around 2019, it didn't arrive with spectacle. It arrived quietly. No declarations. No press tours. No performative confirmation. By the time the public noticed, the relationship already felt settled, grounded rather than dramatic. And by 2022, the arrival of their first child removed any lingering ambiguity. This wasn't a phase. It wasn't a headline moment. It was permanence. That transition mattered more than anyone initially realized. Because for Drake, this wasn't just watching someone else date Rihanna. It was watching a chapter close, without his consent, without his control, and without ceremony. And that kind of unresolved emotional finality doesn't disappear just because time passes. It calcifies. When lyrics stop sounding competitive. On For All the Dogs, Drake delivered verses that immediately caught listeners' attention. Not for their cleverness, but for their tone. These didn't sound like competitive bars. They didn't feel playful. They didn't register as traditional rap sparring. They felt resentful. Lines questioned loyalty, minimized emotional bonds, reframed history in ways that suggested lingering bitterness rather than confidence. In those verses, Rocky wasn't positioned as a peer. He was framed as secondary, someone who benefited from timing, proximity, and circumstance rather than personal merit. That reframing mattered. Because when an artist of Drake's stature recontextualizes another man's success, it isn't just lyrical, it's narrative control. And Rocky noticed. But his response was unconventional. The power of delayed response. Rocky didn't tweet. He didn't post captions. He didn't give interviews filled with innuendo. He did nothing. When asked directly, he chose restraint. He dismissed the conversation. He refused escalation. And to many observers, that silence looked like maturity. But silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes, it's calculation. Sometimes, it's a decision to speak only once, when the timing ensures the message lands permanently. That moment came on Metro Boomin and Future's second collaborative album. And when Rocky finally spoke, the tone was unmistakable. Closure, not competition. Rocky's verse didn't aim to humiliate. It didn't chase headlines. It didn't seek dominance. Instead, it diagnosed. He framed Drake as emotionally frozen, stuck in a past that no longer existed. He dismissed the disses not as threats, but as symptoms of insecurity. And most importantly, he positioned himself as someone who had already moved on. That distinction changed everything. This wasn't rap warfare. It was emotional closure, delivered publicly. There was no invitation for reconciliation. No space left open. No lingering tension to resolve. Just an ending. And endings are dangerous. Not because they answer everything, but because they force us to decide what mattered. When everything has been said, when alliances have shifted, when the noise fades and only patterns remain, the question isn't who won. It's what finally broke. And that begs the real question. When personal boundaries are crossed repeatedly, is silence maturity, or simply delayed confrontation? Rick Ross. When loyalty fractures quietly. Rick Ross's involvement stunned people precisely because it didn't align with the story they thought they knew. This wasn't a casual collaborator turning opportunist. This wasn't a forgotten peer resurfacing for relevance. Ross and Drake shared something far rarer in modern hip-hop. Longevity without public volatility. Their relationship had survived trends, regional shifts, and generational change. Over a decade of collaborations. Records that defined eras, not just charts. Ross had welcomed Drake into his world early, positioning him alongside power rather than competition. Drake, in return, consistently acknowledged Ross as a figure of authority, not just success. Even when their sounds diverged, respect remained visible. So why did it fracture? To understand that, you have to understand how quiet resentment works, especially among men whose brands are built on strength. There was only one moment that ever seemed capable of causing permanent damage. Drake's highly public feud with Meek Mill. Ross, as Meek's mentor and label head, sided with his artist. That was expected. Loyalty, after all, is supposed to be non-negotiable. But when that feud cooled, something unusual happened. Ross and Drake resumed communication. They worked together again. They appeared publicly aligned. By 2017, the narrative was clear. Whatever tension existed had been resolved. Years later, Ross still referred to Drake warmly. As recently as 2023, he described their relationship as close, stable, intact. Which makes what happened next so unsettling. In early 2024, Ross quietly unfollowed Drake on social media. No statement. No explanation. No provocation. First, no one cared. Until they had to. Because shortly afterward, Ross appeared on a project that was openly hostile toward Drake. No coded ambiguity. No neutral framing. The alignment was unmistakable. This wasn't distance. It was positioning. And Drake noticed. But even then, things could have stayed contained, competitive, professional, expected. Until the conflict left the booth. Drake invited Rick Ross's recently separated ex-girlfriend to one of his shows. She made the invitation public. That detail mattered. Because whether intentional or coincidental, perception became reality the moment it hit timelines. This wasn't lyrical sparring. This wasn't industry maneuvering. This was personal. In hip-hop culture, certain lines are understood without being written. Family, partners, and personal relationships sit outside the accepted battlefield, especially between men with shared history. So when Drake crossed that line, the feud changed shape. Not long after, Drake released a diss track aimed directly at Ross. The tone was dismissive. The bars attacked Ross's age, questioned his relevance, and framed Ross's legacy as dependent. Something lent, not earned. Ross didn't wait. He responded immediately. Not with a verse. With a statement in music form. His diss record wasn't playful. It wasn't clever. It was confrontational and expansive, accusing Drake of borrowed identities, ghost-written credibility, and strategic avoidance rather than authentic confrontation. But then Ross escalated. He brought Drake's family into it. And that's when the rules changed. In hip-hop, mentioning family doesn't intensify a feud, it reclassifies it. It signals that the speaker believes respect has already been violated beyond repair. Drake didn't respond with another track. Instead, he dismissed Ross publicly, through gestures, through tone, through silence that felt intentional rather than passive. The message was clear: you're not worth the response. But Ross didn't frame it as defeat. He reframed the entire conflict. According to Ross, the core issue wasn't ego, pride, or music. It was business. He alleged that Drake had applied legal or corporate pressure to a close associate, interfering with a potential release, disrupting leverage behind the scenes. That claim altered everything. Because if true, this wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about control. And suddenly, Ross's response didn't look impulsive. It looked overdue. Not isolated. Accumulated. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't random hostility. It wasn't sudden betrayal. It was accumulation. Years of perceived slights. Moments of silence interpreted as dismissal. Power exercised quietly, never publicly acknowledged. In relationships where one party becomes exponentially more powerful, grievances don't disappear, they wait. So ask yourself, when alliances collapse after years of stability, is it betrayal or unspoken grievances finally reaching their breaking point? The setting matters. Imagine Ross in a Miami studio, cigars and late night, surrounded by a small circle that has watched him build an empire from grit and stamina. He understands legacy as inheritance. You keep the line intact. Drake's rise, in that perspective, felt less like an ascent and more like a reallocation. Across town, in Toronto, Drake's view was different. His early years were marked by quiet ambition, a hunger smoothed by humor and strategy. For him, alliances were tools. Valuable, yes, but removable when the map demanded. These two mental maps collided in small ways for years. Missed calls, guest verse negotiations that dissolved, album placements that shifted. But what finally snapped was intimate and public at once. The ex-girlfriend at a show. Is a single social appearance proof of intent? Or was the show simply the visible seam where private tensions finally stitched together in public view? Kanye West. A conflict built on distrust. If Rick Ross represented a fracture of loyalty, Kanye West represented something else entirely. Distrust from the beginning. Kanye and Drake were never built on emotional security. Their relationship emerged from proximity, shared studios, shared producers, shared ambition, but never from comfort. Early on, Kanye helped shape Drake's sound, offering creative influence during Drake's formative years. But mentorship came with tension. Kanye watched Drake's dominance grow faster than expected, broader than predicted. And resentment followed. Kanye frequently framed Drake's success not as artistry, but as infrastructure, radio, playlists, corporate backing. Success became something engineered, not earned. The real rupture arrived in 2018. Drake's feud with Pusha T collided directly with Kanye's ecosystem. Kanye produced Pusha's album. When deeply personal information surfaced during the battle, blame landed squarely on Kanye, fairly or not. Trust evaporated. From that moment forward, reconciliation attempts felt performative. Temporary truces dissolved quickly. Calm never lasted long enough to settle into belief. Kanye's posture is ideological. He sees structures and symbols, the mechanics beneath culture. To him, an artist is rarely only an artist. They are a node in a system. Drake, in Kanye's view, had become a particularly efficient node, one that translated cultural capital into capital. So when Kendrick Lamar's verse on Like That reignited conversation, Kanye didn't hesitate. But he didn't attack Drake directly. He reframed him. On his remix, Kanye didn't call Drake weak or irrelevant. He positioned him as something more abstract and more dangerous. A system. A representative of corporate control. A symbol of label politics. A beneficiary of structures that others felt excluded from. This wasn't a diss track. It was an ideological statement. And that distinction mattered. Because Kanye wasn't trying to beat Drake. He was trying to redefine him. Picture Kanye at a ranch, Wyoming wind, the decay and construction of his own myth. He drafts lines as architecture, choosing not to wrestle the person but to hollow out the pedestal beneath him. The aim, to make audiences see Drake less as a fellow poet and more as a functionary, an emissary of an industry that prizes predictability over danger. Misread alliances and crowd psychology. As tensions escalated, fans did what fans always do. They hunted for sides. Every collaboration became suspicious. Every appearance became evidence. But not every association was opposition. J. Cole appeared on Metro Boomin and Future's project, immediately triggering speculation. Yet his verse contained nothing. No shots, no subliminals, no coded messages. Just restraint. Consistent with Cole's long-standing refusal to participate in spectacle. Travis Scott faced similar scrutiny. His collaborations were misinterpreted as betrayal, despite being rooted in shared catalogs and performance agreements. Drake even referenced Travis positively, signaling no hostility. NAV's social media behavior sparked rumors, but nothing followed. These moments exposed something uncomfortable. In moments of heightened tension, neutrality is often punished more harshly than opposition. Silence becomes suspicious. Balance becomes betrayal. And fans, hungry for narratives, fill gaps with assumptions. So the question becomes, when chaos dominates the conversation, who benefits from misunderstanding? Consider a late night in a forum thread where anonymous users compile every handshake, every studio photograph, every DJ set into a dossier. For some, the thrill is in pattern recognition, the construction of a storyline. For others, the motive is simpler. Creating drama inflates engagement, which funnels into streams and clicks. Whose interest aligns with keeping the feud alive? Artists sometimes profit from narrative oxygen. Controversy drives conversation. Labels and brands, however, often prefer stability. They monetize predictability. So is the mob's hunger organic, or is it a market response to friction? Why this moment feels different? This backlash wasn't sparked by one lyric. It wasn't triggered by one decision. It was cumulative. Drake reached a level of dominance few artists ever touch. Commercially untouchable, culturally omnipresent, deeply embedded in the business mechanics of music. That level of power reshapes relationships. Some felt sidelined. Others felt dismissed. Some felt used. Others felt unheard. Professional boundaries blurred with personal ones. Business leverage replaced conversation. Silence replaced accountability. Drake became more than a person. He became a symbol. And symbols don't get the benefit of nuance. When symbols crack, everyone projects meaning onto the fracture. A procession of small scenes helps to see the anatomy of this break. There is the award show moment where Drake's glance is misread as dismissal. A studio session where an artist waits for a verse that never arrives. A text message left unanswered that grows into a narrative of contempt. These are tiny ruptures, but they accumulate like frost. At what point does inertia become action? When does polite neglect harden into public estrangement? This moment felt different because it coincided with industry inflections. Streaming economics matured into algorithmic curation. Playlists replaced radio. Brand partnerships became primary revenue. Drake's influence existed inside and outside the music. He pivoted fluidly. Soundtrack placements, sports affiliations, luxury collaborations. That cross-sectional power made him both indispensable and resented. Who envies the builder of worlds? Who envies the person who can translate cultural capital into market movement? The answer is complicated. But the effect is simple. Power concentrates and isolating edges grow sharper. And then the question. Was this an overdue reckoning for Drake, or simply the industry seizing a rare moment of vulnerability? Because once endings arrive, they don't ask permission. They just reveal what was always waiting underneath. The art of escalation. From lines to litigation. Feuds used to play out in the booth. Clever lines, bar-for-bar retorts, clever wordplay that rewarded listeners who followed every nuance. But as stakes escalate, money, legacy, ownership of masters, conflict spills into law firms and boardrooms. Drake's alleged legal maneuvers against a close associate's release changed the narrative from private grievance to corporate warfare. Contracts were pulled, sample clearances became negotiation leverage, and lawyers began to draft cease and desist letters with more fury than diss tracks. The industry learned to weaponize IP the way soldiers weaponize terrain. When music becomes property, feuds become property disputes. When one artist hints at blocking a release, they don't just win a point. They reshape calendars, festival bookings, and streaming algorithms. The ripple effects hit everyone. Producers watch checks stall, managers lose leverage, and the next generation of artists sees collaborations dry up. Ask this. If your career hinges on a mailbag of permissions and favor, how quickly does loyalty calcify into self-preservation? On the day Ross accused Drake of behind-the-scenes interference, the story stopped being about who had better bars and became about who had better leverage. Label executives convened emergency calls. PR teams drafted statements. An industry that usually trades in spectacle suddenly traded in contingency plans. Musicians, who once sought friends among peers, now measured every handshake by a risk-reward calculation. The mood shifted from fraternity to chess. Kanye, Kendrick, and the remix effect. Kanye's remix reframed more than it attacked. By abstracting Drake into a system, Kanye forced listeners to examine structures rather than personalities. Kendrick Lamar's verse on Like That had originally served as cultural commentary. Kanye's use of that moment as a pivot moved the conversation into territory of ideas. Kendrick, famously careful and politic in verse, had always been less about celebrity maneuvers and more about social gravity. His work invites readers to turn toward the larger picture. Race, economics, the moral cost of influence. When Kendrick's voice entered the fray, the fight acquired meaning beyond egos. It asked, what is the cost of cultural translation when entire communities lean on authenticity as survival? Kanye's remix was a scalpel. It separated Drake's person from Drake's network. He painted a picture of an artist who, intentionally or not, had become the visible face of an invisible machine. Did Kanye succeed in this reframing? For a few, yes. Listeners began to interrogate playlists and power structures. But for many, this was just another verse. The question remains, can an artist be both an individual and a symbol? And if not, who decides which hat they wear at which time? Small acts, large consequences. If you trace the damage, you realize it rarely requires a single violent act. Instead, it's a series of small humiliations and overlooked debts. A missed call after a parent's funeral. A ghosted birthday. A verse withheld without explanation. In public, these look trivial. In private, they calcify. Ross's unfollow was small. The invite to a show felt minor. But in aggregate they became evidence. People began to rearrange their social maps. What does this do to younger artists watching? They learn quickly. Rule 1, align with power. Rule 2, do not show weakness. Rule 3, do not trust silence. But is that education or indoctrination? Those raised in the current model internalize a defensiveness that shapes art. More contracts, fewer confessions. More collaborations for business, fewer collaborations for love. The media machine and the culture of proof. Media accelerates fracture. Editors prefer certainty over complexity. A headline that claims X splits from Y spreads faster than a long-form exploration of the subtle reasons behind the split. Social media rewards the simple narrative that someone betrayed someone else. This economy of narrative pushes artists into reductive positions. Be offended or be complicit. The middle becomes uninhabitable. Podcasts, morning shows, and viral threads begin to parse every syllable. Radio DJs dissect gestures. Influencers create countdowns of perceived slights. The culture begins to demand accounts. But are these demands sincere? Or are they part of a broader entertainment loop that monetizes moral outrage? If the latter, who is culpable? The artists for participating, or the ecosystem that profits from spectacle? The human cost. Beyond streams, PR, and charts, there is fatigue. Families get dragged into the conversation. Children learn that public comments can shape private realities. Those closest to artists suffer the confusion of being paraded across timelines without consent. Ross's choice to mention family was not merely a rhetorical escalation. It was a wound inflicted on people who had no say in the conflict. This prompts a painful question. In a world where private lives are party favors for narrative, who gets to define the limits? Artists, too, wear the cost. Isolation can be devastating. To the outside eye, Drake's silence looked like calculated indifference. But silence can also be a defense mechanism. It can be exhaustion. It can be an attempt to avoid inflaming something that has already metastasized. But silence itself becomes a message, one that others translate into arrogance, avoidance, or moral superiority. The paradox: responding invites escalation, ignoring invites scorn. How can one be human inside this bind? Rivalry as ritual. Feuds in hip-hop have historically acted as ritual, a means to test authenticity, to sharpen craft, to force evolution. Battles coax artists to their edges. Some feuds produce classics that stand for generations. But ritual can become real war when the stakes include personal relationships and business empires. What begins as a contest of wills can calcify into a cultural dividing line, rearranging careers and friendships. When Drake and Ross clashed, some of the old ritual logic still applied. Bars would be judged, performances measured, and audiences would decide. But the rules had changed. The modern battlefield includes law firms, influencer economies, and global brand deals. It asks, when ritual becomes business, how do you know what you're fighting for? The aftermath. Shifting alliances and quiet reckonings. Once the loudest moments passed, the fallout was uneven. Some partnerships evaporated quickly. Collaborators who had once been constant found themselves absent from tours, from features, from late-night dinners. Others hardened into alliances of convenience. Younger artists who had built careers on proximity to Drake now felt compelled to choose. Some did, publicly. Others retreated into studio silence. Brand deals that once looked inevitable were paused, contracts re-examined, and calendars rearranged. In private rooms, different conversations unfolded. Executives asked what the industry would tolerate. Artists asked what they wanted to leave to the next generation. There were apologies, some sincere, some contractual. There were reconciliations, some awkward and scheduled in hotels, others never came. What stayed with many was the loss of a certain kind of audience trust. Fans who wanted their idols to be more than symbols, who wanted nuance instead of spectacle. Ultimately, the industry learned a lesson about fragility. The infrastructure that allowed Drake to rise, playlists, labels, brand partnerships, was the same structure that could fracture him. Power always contains the seeds of its own undoing because concentration invites challenge. A closer look. Personal detail and intimacy. To bring texture, imagine a few private moments. Ross in a dim hotel suite, phone glowing with messages that he doesn't answer. He smokes, flips through photos of earlier days, studio sessions with younger Drake, late nights building anthems. He feels a loss that is not simply about ego, it's about the erasure of shared history. Meanwhile, Drake stands on a balcony overlooking Toronto at dawn, haunted by a chorus left unsung. He thinks of strategies, of brand partners, of a family he's trying to protect from rumor and rumor's children. Kanye sits in a cabin, pen in hand, convinced he's clearing the air for a new conversation about power, not merely stoking flames. These are not caricatures. They are people with histories and contradictions. They make choices that are partly tactical and partly emotional. You can resent them for the moves they make, but you must also remember that we rarely see the small betrayals that precede a big one. Questions that refuse easy answers. Throughout this story, keep returning to the probing questions it raises. When does loyalty become an obligation to hold someone to account, and when does it become a demand for silence? Can a person who becomes a symbol ever escape the responsibilities assigned by others? Are public feuds inevitable when the currency of culture is both authenticity and brand value? When an artist leverages corporate influence, does that automatically negate their artistic claims? Who profits when a feud becomes spectacle? The artists, the platforms, or the audiences hungry for drama? Endings and what they reveal. Endings are not tidy. They skitter across the surface of things and expose shapes that were always present. In this case, the ending didn't ask permission. It revealed fractures in relationships that had looked stable precisely because they had never been interrogated publicly. It showed how modern celebrity compresses the private and public into a single waveform, where a personal slight can become a cultural event. The most unsettling revelation is not who was right or who was wrong. It's that the industry enables a kind of transactional intimacy. Friendships become partnerships, partnerships become contracts, and contracts become shields. When those mechanisms fail, the personal becomes public, and people are left to pick up the pieces without a rulebook. A closing image. Picture the stadium after the last diss track has played and the cameras have left. The lights stay on long after the crowd has emptied. Someone sweeps the confetti into a black bag. The stage, once a battlefield, becomes a hollowed space. In the quiet, old songs still echo. People whisper in groups that disperse quickly, each person carrying a narrative that suits them. Somewhere, a young artist listens and learns. They file away the lesson. Alliances are fragile. Power is ambiguous. Silence has its own currency. And then the final question rises again, softer and sharper for all the noise. When personal boundaries are crossed repeatedly, is silence maturity, or simply delayed confrontation? Because in the end, endings do more than close a chapter. They force us to decide what mattered, and what finally broke.